11th of August 1942, Langley, Berkshire. Ken Seth-Smith, Hawker's second test pilot, takes Typhoon R7692 up for a straight and level speed run. Standard work. The brief specifies level speed testing at altitude. Nothing unusual, nothing that demanded particular caution beyond the margin of reserve that flying a Typhoon already required on any given day. The tail comes off in the air above Thorpe, Surrey. Seth-Smith doesn't survive. Sydney Camm receives word within the hour. The first thing he does is rule out pilot error. He knows the machine well enough to know this isn't that. It wasn't the first structural incident on a Typhoon. In May 1940, Hawker's chief test pilot, Philip Lucas, had been aloft in the first prototype, P5212, when the fuselage fractured at the join between the forward and rear sections, the fuselage-to-empennage region that would kill Seth-Smith 2 years and 2 months later. Lucas saw daylight through the split, chose not to bail out, and landed the broken aircraft. He was awarded the George Medal. That 1940 incident was attributed to a separate manufacturing factor and addressed before production began. It was filed and moved past. Seth-Smith's accident was different. The investigation that followed examined not a prototype quirk, but a failure mode in a production aircraft already in RAF squadron service, already being flown on operations against the WWII along the south coast. What emerged over subsequent months, after the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough suspended a complete Typhoon airframe on bungee cords with lowered tyre pressure and drove resonance testing across the entire structure, was a finding that explained not only Seth-Smith's crash, but every similar incident that had preceded it and the ones that would follow before the definitive fix was implemented. 2 frequency nodes existed in the Typhoon's airframe. One sat directly adjacent to the elevator mass balance. In that position, the mass balance, the mechanism installed specifically to suppress elevator flutter, was rendered functionally useless. Resonance built through the structure into the very component designed to arrest it. When the bracket holding the elevator mass balance bell crank linkage failed, uncontrolled flutter developed almost instantaneously. The forces transmitted into the rear fuselage exceeded what the transport joint could withstand. The tail separated. A pilot in that situation had no warning and no recovery option. By the time the flutter was violent enough to register as anything unusual in the controls, the structure was already failing. The RAF's initial response was logical but incomplete. Late 1942 brought reinforcing strips and plates along the rear fuselage. Modifications 256 and 258, introduced in 1943, applied doubler plates to the tailplane spars. The failures continued. Every modification addressed the point where the structure broke. Nothing altered the resonance behavior that caused it to break. The flutter was still present. The patched joint fractured again because the underlying problem had not been touched. How many aircraft were lost this way before the definitive fix was implemented is a number the official records don't settle cleanly. RAF documentation accounts for between 24 and 28 Typhoons destroyed through structural tail failure before the root cause was confirmed. The most commonly cited official figure is 25, though one aircraft in that count was subsequently determined to have been lost to flak damage rather than structural failure, revising the confirmed total to 24. The upper bound could be as high as 28. Whatever the precise number, those losses were entirely independent of anything the Luftwaffe was doing. They were losses to the aircraft's own airframe, Under the stresses of operations, the aircraft was expected to fly. Modification 353, titled Elevator Mass Balance Modified and Inertia Weight Introduced, was formally implemented on February 9, 1944. A 16-pound inertia weight was added to the base of the control column. The elevator mass balance was reduced and modified to 8 pounds in revised configuration. Tail failures ceased after that date. That was more than 2 years after Seth-Smith's crash. Between the first structural fatality in August 1942 and the definitive fix in February 1944, the Typhoon was flying combat operations, initially as a low-level interceptor, then increasingly as a ground attack aircraft over France, with an unresolved airframe condition that could kill the pilot under loads the aircraft encountered regularly. The tail wasn't the only problem. The Napier Saber's exhaust stub design was defective. Exhaust gases from the 24-cylinder sleeve valve engine were entering the cockpit, not in acute concentrations, but sufficient to impair pilot judgment over the course of a sortie, slowly, without clear warning. The first confirmed fatal crash attributed to carbon monoxide was documented in November 1941. Modification 293 attempted to address exhaust gas ingress through revised stub design. It didn't solve it. The practical answer was procedural. Every pilot would don their oxygen mask and switch on the oxygen supply before the engine started, and would keep it on for the full sortie. That standing order effectively removed the acute fatality risk. But it also established as routine procedure that Typhoon pilots strapped respirators to their faces before every flight, because the aircraft's own exhaust might otherwise incapacitate them before an enemy gunner had the opportunity. The chin radiator, a large housing positioned prominently below the Saber's nose, necessary for the liquid-cooled engine, sat at the lowest point of the airframe on every attack run. Ground attack operations, which by 1943 constituted the primary role of most Typhoon squadrons over France and the Low Countries, meant low passes over defended targets. A single rifle-caliber round through the radiator destroyed the coolant system. A liquid-cooled engine without coolant overheats in minutes. The chin radiator was a thermal necessity and a highly visible, geometrically exposed target on every sortie. Pilots knew it. Ground commanders knew it. It was never fully addressed on the production Typhoon. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, who flew Typhoons with 609 Squadron before taking on a Hawker production test role and then commanding the first operational Tempest wing, described the Typhoon's character precisely. Once pilots established that the noise, vibration, and general commotion from the big Sabre engine and the drafty cockpit with its rattling side windows weren't actually breaking anything, the aircraft proved pleasantly stable and responsive, very maneuverable, and exceptionally so at speeds above 400 miles per hour. A 75% power low-level cruise produced over 300 miles per hour. Maximum level speed around 385 miles per hour. At the dive limit of 500 miles per hour, he found adequate control remaining, though with heavy control forces and an impressive noise level. What that description captures is an aircraft that was genuinely formidable at what it could actually do, and genuinely dangerous at the boundaries of that capability. Test pilot E.W. Jock Boner discovered those boundaries during a series of high-speed dive tests investigating oil scavenging problems. Rolling into a dive at 35,000 feet, Boner put the Typhoon into a vertical descent. The aircraft accelerated rapidly. At some point, all three control surfaces, elevators, rudder, and ailerons, went completely unresponsive at once. Compressibility had taken control of the aircraft. Bonner managed to pull out using only the elevator trimmers, descended into denser air where conventional control resumed, and landed an aircraft whose wing skins were visibly shuddering and flapping. The Typhoon was a write-off. Bonner was alive. The phenomenon he had encountered, compressibility, was as yet imperfectly understood and essentially unavoidable in the Typhoon's configuration. Sergeant A. Shannon of No. 257 Squadron, describing his first Typhoon takeoff. The engine was quite a huge thing and frightened the life out of me when I just got in and opened the throttle. I felt, after the takeoff, which didn't disturb me too much, that I was up to 15,000 feet before I knew it, before I started to think. It was frightening, and I rather think it flew me rather than I flew it for a while. Pilot Officer Simpson of No. 198 Squadron, after enough hours to have formed a considered view, settled on this. As an aircraft to go to war in, it was a magnificent gun platform. Both assessments are right, simultaneously. In the Typhoon's first 9 months of combat operations, more pilots were killed through mechanical and structural failure than through enemy action, a figure recorded by pilot Douglas Gordon drawing directly on documented experience of the period. Senior voices at the Air Ministry considered cancelling the programme entirely in early 1943. The 609 Squadron pilots who kept the cancellation lobby at bay, shooting down more than 20 enemy fighter bombers on the south coast between October 1942 and July 1943, were flying an aircraft with an unresolved tail flutter problem, a carbon monoxide hazard managed by procedural workaround, a chin radiator that invited every ground gunner in France, and compressibility characteristics that could strip the pilot of control at speeds the aircraft was occasionally required to reach. Camm had been working on the solution since March 1940. The design office was in Esher, Surrey. Hawker had relocated there in the early part of the war, dispersing the design function away from Kingston as protection against bombing. 45 draftsmen were working through the technical schematics by the time the project was formally cleared. Camm had been thinking about the wing problem since the first compressibility effects appeared on the prototype. A thick wing could push an aircraft past 400 miles per hour, but not much past it, and not reliably, and not at altitudes where high-speed interception duties required the aircraft to go. NACA in the United States had been developing laminar flow aerofoil sections with a fundamentally different geometry, and Hawker's engineers had been studying that work since March 1940. The physics are specific. A conventional aerofoil places maximum wing thickness near the leading edge at roughly 30% of chord. Boundary layer flow transitions from laminar to turbulent early, generating drag across the upper surface. A laminar flow aerofoil moves maximum thickness rearward to 37.5% of chord, maintaining smooth laminar flow over a longer proportion of the upper surface before transition occurs. The pressure distribution changes in ways that reduce drag measurably across a wider speed range. The North American P-51 Mustang was built around the same principle. Its prototype flew in October 1940. The Typhoon wing used a NACA 4-digit series section. Maximum thickness to chord ratio 19.5% at the root, tapering to 12% at the tip, with maximum thickness at 30% of chord. A deliberately thick wing, chosen for structural depth and fuel volume. It worked at speeds below roughly 400 miles per hour. Above that, compressibility effects imposed a ceiling that was essentially built into the profile. The new wing Camm's team designed for what they were calling the Typhoon II had a maximum thickness-to-chord ratio of 14.5% at the root, tapering to 10% at the tip, with maximum thickness moved to 37.5% of chord. The wing root was 5 inches thinner than the Typhoon's at the equivalent cross-section. The planform shifted to a near elliptical shape, which improved lift distribution and accommodated the ammunition feeds for 4 20mm Hispano cannon moved further back into the wing. The surface would be flush riveted throughout, essential for a laminar flow aerofoil, because a rivet head projecting above the skin surface disrupts the boundary layer the profile is designed to maintain. A laminar flow wing finished to anything less than laminar flow tolerances performs no better than a conventional one. The original wingspan was longer than the Typhoon's, at 43 feet. Wingtips were later clipped to 41 feet, marginally shorter than the Typhoon's 41 feet 7 inches, while the near elliptical planform produced greater wing area overall, 302 square feet against the Typhoon's 249. A larger, thinner, more aerodynamically refined surface, and one that generated noticeably less drag at speeds where the Typhoon was already in difficulty. The thinner profile eliminated the leading-edge fuel tanks the Typhoon carried. Hawker's engineers added a new 76 imperial gallon fuel bay ahead of the cockpit between the oil tank and engine, which required lengthening the fuselage by 21 inches. The Tempest ran 33 feet 8 inches against the Typhoon's 31 feet 11 inches. That additional length improved pitch stability, the longer fuselage moment arm giving pilots more consistent high-speed control feel, something the Typhoon's comparatively short tail moment had never fully provided. Ailerons gained spring-loaded tabs that improved roll response, specifically above 250 miles per hour. Camm also proposed eliminating the chin radiator entirely. His solution? Build the engine radiators into the leading edges of the wing, inboard of the undercarriage legs, moving the Typhoon's most exposed thermal component off the nose and distributing it across a more protected, aerodynamically integrated surface. The sole Tempest Mark I prototype, serial number HM599, was built to this specification, powered by the Napier Sabre 4 engine with wing-mounted radiators. Philip Lucas flew HM599's first flight on February 24, 1943, the same pilot who had landed the broken first prototype in 1940 and earned the George Medal for doing so. Without the chin radiator generating drag at the nose, with the new laminar flow wing generating far less drag at all speeds, the Mark I reached 466 miles per hour during test flights. That number is the Typhoon's structural problems and aerodynamic limitations fully answered, expressed as a single velocity. The aircraft Camm had been designing since March 1940, realized in a single prototype. Then the Sabre 4 failed its bench tests, repeatedly. Napier couldn't achieve consistent, reliable power output from the new engine variant. The Ministry of Aircraft Production eventually abandoned it and cancelled the Mark I as a production program. The Tempest that went to war, the production Mark V, had to be built around the Sabre 2B, already proven in the Typhoon, delivering approximately 2,200 horsepower from the same 24-cylinder sleeve valve configuration. The Sabre 2B used the Typhoon's existing cooling system, which meant the undernose radiator returned. The chin installation on the production Tempest 5 was a compromise enforced by Napier's development failure, not a design preference. What the Mark V retained was everything that mattered for performance below 20,000 feet. The laminar flow wing with its 14.5% root thickness ratio, the flush riveted surface, the 21-inch fuselage extension, the spring-loaded ailerons, and the single-piece sliding bubble canopy that had been trialled on Typhoons since January 1943, giving pilots rearward visibility that the original car door canopy had prevented entirely. Pilots transitioning from Typhoons to Tempests noticed the difference immediately, not just in the instruments or the handling feel, but in what they could see. A pilot who could check 6 o'clock without turning his entire aircraft was a pilot who survived longer in contested airspace. The first production Mark V, serial JN729, rolled off Hawker's Langley facility on June 21, 1943. Test pilot Bill Humble flew the maiden flight. Speed achieved 432 miles per hour at 18,400 feet. The Typhoon topped out around 400 miles per hour under comparable conditions. 32 miles per hour faster on the first flight of the first production aircraft, before any further development work. Pilots from the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at Boscombe Down assessed a prototype in February 1943 and submitted a report that contained 4 words never written about the Typhoon: no major handling faults. The Air Ministry had formally renamed the design on February 28, 1942. It had been the Typhoon II, internally the Hawker P1012. The renaming acknowledged that the aircraft had diverged far enough from its predecessor to constitute something else entirely. The Tempest, they called it. A speed figure gets misattributed in some coverage of this period. The Tempest is occasionally described as reaching 440 miles per hour at low altitude. The Typhoon around 400 miles per hour. The documented figures for the Tempest Mark V are approximately 432 miles per hour at 18,400 feet on the maiden production flight, approximately 435 miles per hour at 17,000 feet in one set of trials, and 442 miles per hour at 15,200 feet in another. These are mid-altitude figures, between 15,000 and 18,400 feet. The common correction: Typhoon 400 miles per hour, Tempest 440 miles per hour, is directionally accurate. The altitude qualification matters for precision. The Tempest's decisive advantage was at low and medium altitudes below 20,000 feet. Above that ceiling, the Spitfire Mark XIV, with its 2-stage supercharged Griffon engine, regained the speed advantage. The P-51D pulled ahead above 24,000 feet as well. The Napier Saber's power fell off rapidly above 20,000 feet. Sabre-powered aircraft were instructed not to seek combat above that ceiling. In the band below 20,000 feet, the altitude at which tactical operations over northwest Europe were actually conducted, the Tempest was the fastest single-engine piston fighter available to the RAF. That constraint and that description map identically onto the aircraft's entire operational role. Number 150 wing achieved full operational status at RAF Newchurch, Kent, in May 1944. The wing comprised Number 3 Squadron and Number 486 New Zealand Squadron, with Number 56 Squadron on Spitfire 9s awaiting Tempests. Roland Beaumont, who had been at 609 Squadron at 21, spent 1942 as a Hawker production test pilot, flying the very aircraft he had been arguing about at fighter development conferences, and was now wing commander, commanding the 1st Tempest unit into operations. Brought the wing through late spring patrols and shipping reconnaissance. The aircraft were ready. The war had briefly moved away from their sector. D-Day came and went. The wing flew sorties over the beaches on June 6, 1944, without making contact. On June 8th, D+2, Beaumont led a sweep behind the Normandy beachhead. 5 Messerschmitt Bf 109Gs appeared in line astern, 5,000 feet below. He took No. 3 Squadron down into them, closed on his target and destroyed it. The 109 pilots had not detected the Tempests above them. The attack was fully committed before the first break. The subsequent engagement scattered the formation. It wasn't a complex fight, and it didn't need to be. The geometry was correct. The approach was clean. The Tempest had the altitude and the angle. That kill was the first air-to-air victory credited to a Tempest in operational service. 5 days later, Germany fired the first Fieseler FZG-76 flying bombs against southern England. The morning of the 13th of June 1944, one detonated in Bethnal Green, East London, killing 6 people and seriously injuring 9. By that evening, the pattern of the campaign was clear. The FZG-76, the V1, the Buzz Bomb, the Doodlebug, was a pulse jet-powered, gyroscopically stabilized airframe roughly 25 feet in length, carrying an 1,870-pound warhead, guided by preset gyroscopes linked to an air vane counter on the nose. When the counter reached 0, the fuel supply cut. The engines stopped. People on the ground learned to stop listening to the distinctive pulse jet note and start listening for the silence that followed. Because after the silence came the dive. The V1 cruised at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Spitfire Vs couldn't reliably intercept it in level flight at those heights. The Tempest, operating at 435 miles per hour at its optimum altitude in the band where V1s flew, had approximately 35 miles per hour of closing speed, roughly 50 feet per second of closure. Managing a firing solution at that closing rate required precision that admitted no margin for adjustment. Fire too far out and the warhead survived and detonated on target. Fire from close range and detonate the warhead within the debris radius, and the explosion could destroy the intercepting aircraft. The workable range developed in practice fell between 200 and 300 yards, close enough for the 4 Hispano cannon to be structurally effective against the V1's airframe, far enough for a hard break to clear the blast. The break itself had to be immediate and committed. An 1,870-pound warhead detonating at 250 yards does not leave a slow turn much margin. Pilots develop methods. Some learn to fly alongside a V1, slide a wingtip under the bomb's wing, and roll it off its gyroscopic axis. No guns, no ammunition expended, just precise formation flying within feet of a live warhead at 400 miles per hour over the English countryside. Others used the 420mm Hispano cannon at the correct range. The explosive shell from a Hispano at a properly managed range would destroy the pulse jet, shatter the nose gyroscopes, or detonate the warhead directly. All 3 produced a kill. Each required the pilot to be in the correct position at the correct closing rate while the target was travelling at 400 miles per hour, 2,000 feet above Kent. Squadron leader Joseph Berry could do it in his sleep. He did it 59 times. 59 V-1 flying bombs attributed to a single pilot. A figure that becomes more striking the longer you think about the geometry of each individual engagement. The patrol altitude, the vector from ground control, the descent to the V-1's height, the closing approach, the decision point, the 4-cannon burst, the break to clear the blast, and then the climb back to patrol altitude to reset and do it again. Between June 13th and September 5th, 1944, Tempests from No. 150 Wing destroyed 638 flying bombs in total. No. 3 Squadron alone claimed 305. The RAF also deployed Meteor jet fighters in the anti-V-1 role during the summer of 1944. An important historical context because it establishes the Tempest's contemporaneous relevance. At precisely the moment the RAF was introducing its first operational jet aircraft, its most effective anti-V-1 weapon was the piston-powered fighter that Sidney Camm's team in Esher had been designing since 1940. The Meteor flew alongside the Tempest in this role. The Tempest accumulated the larger kill total. When Allied armies overran the main V-1 launch sites in northern France in early September 1944, the campaign against London effectively ended. No. 150 Wing transferred to 2nd Tactical Air Force offensive operations in October, crossing to the continent and beginning operations that would take Tempest squadrons through the Netherlands and into Germany through the final 7 months of the war. Pierre Clostermann, the Free French ace who joined No. 3 Squadron in March 1945 and documented his experiences in The Big Show, flew Tempests through this final continental phase. His account describes an operational tempo that matched the V-1's summer. Rail infrastructure, Luftwaffe airfields, air superiority patrols over a shrinking Reich, and the steady attrition of what remained of German air power. The Tempest's 4 cannon were effective against ground targets as well as air. The structural robustness inherited from the Typhoon's stressed skin construction tolerated low-level anti-aircraft damage that would have been catastrophic in more lightly built aircraft. The jets were visible from the cockpit by then. The Me-262 had been operational in increasing numbers since late 1944, moving through German airspace at approximately 540 miles per hour in level flight, a speed advantage over the Sabre-powered Tempest that wasn't a competition. The Tempest had no ability to catch an Me-262 in a straight pursuit at altitude. But the Me-262's operational pattern created vulnerabilities that didn't require a speed advantage to exploit. Jumo 004 turbojets responded poorly to rapid throttle changes. The risk of compressor stall and flameout was real enough that pilots were trained to manage power changes slowly and carefully. On approach and landing, Me-262s required long, straight runs with throttles carefully set, speed reduced well ahead of the threshold. These approach patterns were predictable and visible at range. Allied fighters, Tempests and Mustangs among them, learned to orbit Luftwaffe jet airfields and time their attacks to the windows when the jets were at minimum maneuvering speed and most exposed. Operational records credit the Tempest with approximately 20 Me-262 kills during the war. The Mustang, flying in greater numbers in areas where Me-262 operations were concentrated, accumulated a significantly higher total. The Tempest's contribution was genuine but limited, a measure of operational geometry rather than any speed parity with the jet. It was the right aircraft at the right airfields, at the moments when the Me-262 was most vulnerable. Not a machine that could engage jets on equal terms in open sky. 3/JG54 was assigned airfield protection duty for ME-262 operations, placing their FW190D9s in repeated direct contact with Tempests over those same airfields. The FW190D9, Dora to Luftwaffe pilots, was what Germany had produced to answer the same general problem the Tempest represented on the Allied side. A piston-engine fighter pushed to the practical limit of the configuration. The first major engagement between the two was documented on December 27, 1944, above Munster. 8 aircraft from number 486 New Zealand Squadron on armed reconnaissance to the Paderborn area encountered approximately 60 FW190D9s from 3/JG54 on large-scale airfield protection duty for AR-234 jet bombers. The Doras were stacked between 6,500 and 10,000 feet. Hauptmann Robert Weiss, the Gruppenkommandeur, Knight's Cross, 122 victories, ordered the formation to alter course when ground control reported the Tempests. Leading the New Zealand formation was squadron leader Keith Taylor Cannon, known to his men as Hyphen, whose record included a V1 kill and a shared ME-262. His report of what followed, as documented by Robert Forsyth in the Osprey account of the engagement. We were flying at 10,000 feet and sighted the Huns in 2 gaggles at 12 o'clock to us, one formation of 105 109s and 190s at 9,000 feet, with top cover of 20 plus 109s and 190s at approximately 14,000 feet. His red section went down into the lower formation. Green section climbed to engage the top cover. 10 Staffel under Lieutenant Peter Crump, a 24 victory ace. Taylor Cannon opened fire at 200 yards on a FW190D9 that had not yet broken. He observed strikes. The aircraft blew up as he pulled up sharply to avoid it. Pilot Officer Sid Short and Pilot Officer Keith Smith each claimed a D9 in the same pass. Smith's combat report. I closed the range and when within 200 yards fired a short burst and another at very close range of 20 yards using a full ring of deflection. The FW190 blew up. I couldn't avoid the explosion but broke to starboard as I flew through it. When the engagement resolved, number 486 Squadron had downed 5 FW190D9s for the loss of 1 Tempest. Pilot Officer Bevan Hall, killed when Crump put cannon strikes on his aircraft. The pilots of 10/JG54 were sufficiently shaken that Weiss rested the Staffel for several days. One of the German pilots, writing in his diary afterward, "I just escaped from a wild dogfight with my skin. Our formation disintegrated completely, no trace of an air battle, just wild confusion." Another wrote home saying he had to praise his machine, that the aircraft had been tested severely and held together. Total confirmed aerial victories credited to the Tempest across the war. Approximately 240, recorded in Flypast magazine's operational assessment of the type. Performance comparisons between the Tempest and its contemporaries require explicit altitude qualifiers. A comparison without stated conditions isn't a comparison, it's a selection of convenient numbers. Against the FW190D9, the Dora's UMO 213A engine produced peak performance at approximately 18,400 feet, where RAF comparative trial data recorded approximately 432 miles per hour maximum speed in full supercharger gear. This is essentially the same altitude and essentially the same speed as the Tempest's documented mid-altitude performance. The D9 held a measurable advantage in roll rate, an edge noted consistently in RAF operational assessments of the aircraft, reflecting the FW190's inherent roll authority from its broad-chord ailerons and radial engine configuration. The Dora climbed more effectively than the Tempest in sustained climbs at altitude. Below roughly 15,000 feet, where the Tempest's Sabre 2B produced its best specific output relative to the UMO 213A's altitude-dependent supercharger performance, the speed gap opened in the Tempest's favour and translated directly into combat initiative. Neither aircraft was categorically superior across all conditions. The Munster engagement showed what the Tempest achieved with geometry on its side. JG-26's operational reports from the final months of the war acknowledged the threat without qualification. Against the Spitfire Mark 14, the division is by altitude, cleanly and without ambiguity. Below 20,000 feet, the Tempest was faster. The Spitfire 14's two-stage supercharged Griffon pushed its performance peak higher. Above roughly 20,000 feet, it recovered the speed advantage. Flypast noted that Spitfire adherents citing the 14 as the superior aircraft aren't wrong in the altitude band where the Spitfire 14 was actually superior. High-altitude interception. The Tempest pilots, who shot down 638 V1s at 2,000 feet over Kent, weren't wrong that their aircraft was the right machine for that specific task. These weren't competing claims about the same envelope. They were accurate claims about different envelopes, and both were true in their respective contexts. Against the P-51D Mustang, maximum speed at comparable altitude was essentially equal. P-51D approximately 437 miles per hour, Tempest approximately 435 miles per hour. The decisive operational difference was range. The Mustang at 951 miles combat radius against the Tempest's 740 miles. A gap of 211 miles that determined which aircraft flew from East Anglia to Berlin with 8th Air Force bombers and which flew from Newchurch to Arnhem with 2nd Tactical Air Force. These were different missions requiring different machines. Both aircraft were correctly configured for what they were actually asked to do. The Tempest's 420mm Hispano cannon delivered heavier explosive mass per round than the 6.50 caliber Brownings in the P-51D, a genuine advantage against the specific targets the Tempest encountered. V-1 airframes, attacking fighter formations at close range, and ground targets requiring concentrated structural damage. The service ceiling of approximately 36,500 feet compared to the P-51D's 41,900 feet reflects the Sabre's supercharger limitation. Everything about the aircraft's design and combat record was internally consistent with the low to medium altitude specialist role. Its developers knew what they were building. The RAF's employment of it confirmed they understood what they had. Why the Tempest is absent from most comprehensive World War II aviation surveys has structural and circumstantial explanations, and neither requires inventing a grievance. Structurally, approximately 1,702 Tempests were built across all marks. Spitfire total production exceeded 20,000 examples. The P-51D variant alone exceeded 8,000 units. Aviation histories are broadly proportional to production volume. More aircraft means more pilots, more memoirs, more squadron diaries, more surviving examples at airshows, more photographs, more documentaries commissioned by audiences who remember seeing the aircraft fly. A type built in numbers less than a tenth of the Spitfires generates proportionally fewer primary sources for any historian working from the available record. The circumstantial problem is timing. The Tempest became operational in May 1944. The war in Europe ended May 1945. 12 months of frontline service in one theatre, bookended on one side by the Typhoon's maturation as a ground attack platform, and on the other by the Meteor's arrival as the RAF's first operational jet. Aviation histories built around clear narrative arcs. Battle of Britain, strategic bomber offensive, transition to jets, have no natural slot for an aircraft that appeared precisely at the seam between the last two of those chapters. It arrived at the transition the narrative wanted to treat as a jump cut, and fell through. The Sea Fury demonstrates the contrast. Developed from the Tempest and entering Royal Navy service in 1947, the Sea Fury flew in Korea. Fleet Air Arm pilots aboard HMS Ocean and HMS Theseus engaged North Korean forces, fought MiG-15 jet fighters, and occasionally prevailed. Lieutenant Peter Carmichael of 802 Naval Air Squadron shot down a MiG-15 in August 1952, one of the last confirmed occasions where a propeller-driven fighter scored a kill against a swept-wing jet in operational service. That post-war chapter keeps the Sea Fury in the literature across multiple decades of aviation publishing. The Tempest has no equivalent second act. Its operational history is complete within 12 months of European operations, followed by second-line RAF roles and export service to India and Pakistan. Real service, but generating nothing that gives aviation editors a peg for a new story every decade. There is also no flying Typhoon anywhere in the world. The RAF Museum Hendon holds the sole surviving complete example. Typhoon Mark 1B, serial MN235, returned to static display in late November 2018 following restoration work. Aviation history is transmitted substantially through what audiences can see and hear. The Spitfire appears at British air shows every summer, generating new enthusiasts with each pass. The Typhoon and Tempest family is represented by nothing airworthy. No Sabre engine turning at low level, no sound to compare with the Merlin-powered aircraft that dominate warbird displays. That disparity compounds across each decade and each new generation of potential advocates. The Hawker Typhoon Preservation Group is working against that pattern. The project includes a Napier Sabre 2A engine, serial number 2484, confirmed as under active restoration. The goal is a flying Typhoon, the first in the world if it succeeds. No confirmed completion date has been publicly announced. The project is active, funded, and progressing. If the aircraft becomes airworthy, the 24-cylinder H-block sleeve valve engine that powered both the Typhoon and the Tempest will be heard again at low level over English airspace for the first time in decades. Pilots and ground crew who worked with Typhoons and Tempests during the war described the Sabre at operational power as genuinely distinctive, higher in frequency and more complex in harmonic than the Merlin, a sound that people remembered specifically and didn't confuse with anything else. The aircraft that audiences can hear tend to accumulate more advocates than the aircraft preserved behind glass. A flying Typhoon changes the family's relationship with the public in ways no museum placard can replicate. Sidney Camm joined H.G. Hawker Engineering in 1923 and was appointed chief designer the following year, at 31 years old. By 1937, 84% of the RAF's aircraft were his designs, not his company's distributed output, his specific designs. The Fury, the Heart, the Demon, the Audax, the Hardy, the Hind, and then the Hurricane, which was in production before the Typhoon design began and in combat before the Typhoon's problems were understood. He was responsible across his career for 52 different aircraft types, from which approximately 26,000 examples were manufactured. At the time of his death in 1966, the company he had joined 43 years earlier was still building aircraft that traced directly to his design philosophy. The BBC's profile of Camm states the lineage plainly. He was responsible for the Hawker Typhoon, Tempest, Sea Fury, Seahawk, Hunter and the prototype to what would become the Harrier. 6 aircraft across 4 decades, each one inheriting what the previous design had established, each one solving what the previous design had left unsolved. The Sea Fury's development was formally initiated by Camm in September 1942, 12 months before the Tempest made its first operational flight, and simultaneous with the RAF's peak period of Typhoon tail failure investigation. Specification F.2/43, issued May 1943, required at least 450 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, a climb rate no less than 4,500 feet per minute to 20,000 feet, and 4 20mm Hispano 5 cannon. Designed as a lighter, faster successor to the Tempest, the Fury incorporated the Tempest's semi-elliptical wing directly, shortened by eliminating the central bay of the wing centre section. The fuselage was broadly similar in form to the Tempest's, but fully monocoque throughout. The Bristol Centaurus radial engine replaced the Sabre, a reliability decision, not a performance limitation, since the Centaurus produced competitive power with considerably greater dependability. The Fury prototype flew on September 1, 1944. When the RAF cancelled its Fury order at the war's end, they had sufficient late Spitfires and Tempests. The Admiralty acquired the type for carrier operations, redesignated it the Sea Fury, brought it into service in 1947 and took it to Korea. The Seahawk was Hawker's first jet aircraft. The design concept originated in November 1944 as a proposal to adapt the Fury's piston airframe for jet propulsion. The same basic fuselage geometry, the same design team's understanding of how to distribute stress and weight, with a Rolls-Royce NEN turbojet substituted for the piston engine. The P1040 design, refined with a bifurcated tailpipe arrangement by December 1944, reached production when a contract for 151 aircraft was placed on November 22, 1949. Total production across Hawker, Armstrong Whitworth and a Focke-Wulf manufacturing licence reached 535 aircraft. The Seahawk served the Fleet Air Arm through the late 1950s, was acquired by the Indian Navy and remained in Indian service significantly longer. Hawker's Secret Projects describes it as Hawker's first excursion into the jet field. The monocoque construction philosophy, the wing geometry, the accumulated understanding of how to build a reliable, high-performance airframe, all carried forward from the piston lineage into the jet age with institutional continuity intact. The Hunter arrived next. Prototype P.1067, first flight 1951. RAF service entry July 1954. Built in 1972 examples, supplied to more than 24 air forces, and still operational with several of them into the 21st century. Flypast described it as Camm's masterpiece, sleek, svelte, and above all, graceful, which captures its standing as the culminating expression of the Hawker design team's jet age work. It replaced the Meteor and the Venom in RAF service and defined a generation of Cold War tactical jet operations. The P1127 flew in 1960. Camm was still active as chief designer when the aircraft demonstrated that vertical takeoff was an operational reality rather than an aeronautical curiosity. He retired in 1965. Ralph Hooper succeeded him as chief designer. On 12th of March 1966, Sidney Camm died at Richmond Golf Club at the age of 72. The Harrier entered RAF service in 1969, 3 years after his death. The aircraft whose concept he had personally worked toward was declared operational by an Air Force he didn't live to see receive it. Hawker's Secret Projects notes, in passing, that 6 designs later, the Harrier had a really outstanding wing. Each of those 6 designs was produced by the same company, the same accumulation of aerodynamic and structural knowledge, the same design philosophy that Camm had been developing since he joined Hawker in 1923. The line from Typhoon to Harrier runs without interruption. Typhoon tail failures in 1942 drove the resonance testing that diagnosed the mass balance flutter mechanism and produced the understanding that informed every subsequent Hawker airframe. The laminar flow wing developed for the Tempest in the Escher design office was the aerodynamic proof of concept that carried the team through the Sea Fury's design into the jet age geometry of the Seahawk and Hunter. The VTOL work of the P1127 was the final expression of a design team that had been solving consecutive generations of apparently impossible problems since at least 1936. The Tempest is the pivot. Not the most famous aircraft in the chain, not the most produced, not the one with the most dramatic post-war narrative. The aircraft that proved the design team could build past their own failures, that the engineering lessons of the Typhoon's catastrophic first 2 years had been absorbed, understood, and converted into something that worked, and passed that demonstrated capability forward to everything that followed. One contemporaneous assessment, drawing on access to the Hawker design team's internal documentation, described the Tempest as perhaps the best fighter in the RAF at the time of its service entry. Number 150 Wing's Tempests destroyed 638 V-1 flying bombs in under 3 months. Approximately 240 confirmed aerial victories in 12 months of frontline operations. 20 Me-262 jet aircraft engaged during their most vulnerable operational moments and destroyed by an aircraft that couldn't pursue them in open sky and found another route to effectiveness anyway. A direct role in the design lineage that produced the Harrier, without which the modern close support aircraft descended from that program wouldn't exist. The Tempest's absence from mainstream aviation history isn't a mystery. 12 months of service, 1,702 aircraft built, no surviving airworthy examples, no post-war combat chapter, and the misfortune of arriving exactly where aviation's dominant narrative preferred to place a transition rather than a fighter. It fell through the gap between 2 stories that both have better press. But the gap is real, and the aircraft that should fill it's documented, specific, and measurable. The V-1 kill count that no other RAF aircraft matched in that campaign. The design architecture that ran forward without interruption from a laminar flow wing tested in a Surrey design office in 1940 to a vertical takeoff jet that changed what air forces expected of an airfield. The engineering decision sequence. Every Typhoon failure and the Tempest solution to each one. That constitutes one of the most consequential development programs in British aviation. The Hawker Typhoon Preservation Group is physically working to close part of that gap. Whether the Tempest gets its proper historical position depends partly on whether anyone puts the evidence in front of an audience that hasn't seen it assembled in one place. The question was never whether the aircraft mattered. The question was always whether anyone was paying close enough attention to notice what the aviation histories had left out. Subscribe for more stories like this.